The day the Mississippi became an ocean. The 1927 flood that redrew the United States. On the morning of April 21, 1927, the river that had fed a nation decided to swallow it whole. The Mississippi, that ancient artery of commerce and culture, broke free from its banks and became something no one had ever imagined. It became an ocean of brown water stretching from horizon to horizon, erasing towns, farms, and dreams in a matter of hours. This is the story of the day America learned that nature keeps no promises, and progress means nothing when the levees break. Chapter 1. The spring of 1927 arrived in the Mississippi Delta, with a warmth that seemed almost generous. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under pale blue skies, and the air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms drifting from plantation gardens. In Greenville, Mississippi, a bustling town of nearly 15,000 souls, life moved to the rhythm of commerce and community. Steamboats lined the waterfront, their whistles punctuating the humid afternoons. Children ran through unpaved streets, kicking up dust that would soon become mud, though they did not know it yet. The merchants opened their shops each morning with the confidence of men who believed tomorrow would be much like today. The farmers tended their fields with the patience of generations. The river flowed past, wide and brown, seemingly eternal in its indifference. William Alexander Percy was a man of letters and law, the son of Senator Leroy Percy, and a figure of considerable influence in the Delta. On that April morning, he stood on the porch of his family home, watching the clouds gather in the western sky. The rains had been falling for months, relentless and unforgiving. The Ohio River had flooded, the Missouri had surged, and now the Mississippi itself was rising higher than anyone could remember. William had received telegrams from contacts upriver, each one more alarming than the last. The levees in Arkansas were under stress. The levees in Missouri had been breached. The entire watershed was draining toward the Delta, like water swirling toward a drain. But Greenville had its levees, massive earthen walls that stretched for miles along the riverbank, built by the labor of thousands over decades. The Army Corps of Engineers had declared them impenetrable. The newspapers had printed reassurances. The levees would hold. They had always held. William wanted to believe this. He had staked his family's fortune on the Delta's future. He had invested in land and cotton and the infrastructure of a society that depended on the river's cooperation. 300 miles north, in Cairo, Illinois, the river had already claimed its first victims. Entire neighborhoods sat submerged under 10 feet of water. Families huddled on rooftops, waiting for rescue boats that came too slowly. The Red Cross had established emergency camps, but the sheer scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Volunteers worked through the night, pulling survivors from flooded homes, distributing blankets and hot coffee, trying to impose order on chaos. Still, the news that reached Greenville was filtered through optimism. The flood was a northern problem. The Delta would be spared. The levees were strong. The engineers were confident. Mary Louise Hamilton was a schoolteacher in Greenville, 32 years old, unmarried, devoted to her students and her church. She lived in a small cottage near the colored section of town, a neighborhood called the Yazoo District. Her neighbors were sharecroppers and domestic workers, families who had built their lives on the margins of the Delta economy. They trusted Mary Louise because she treated them with dignity in a time when dignity was not freely given. She knew their children by name. She knew their struggles and their hopes. She had taught some of their parents to read. On the evening of April 20th, Mary Louise attended a prayer meeting at Mount Zion Baptist Church. The congregation sang hymns of deliverance, their voices rising through the wooden rafters. Reverend Isaiah Green spoke of trials and tribulations, of floods both literal and spiritual. He did not know how prophetic his words would prove. The congregation prayed for rain to cease, for the river to recede, for the protection of their families and their homes. They prayed with the fervor of people who had learned that prayer was sometimes the only resource available to them. Outside, the rain began again. It fell in sheets, hammering the tin roofs and turning the streets into rivers. The Mississippi, already swollen beyond recognition, pressed against the levees with the weight of an entire continent, draining toward the sea. Engineers patrolled the embankments with lanterns, watching for seepage, for sand boils, for any sign of weakness. They had been watching for weeks. They were exhausted, anxious and increasingly uncertain. The river was behaving in ways they had never seen. The pressure against the levees was unlike anything in their experience. At 12:30 in the morning, the Mounds Landing levee, 12 miles north of Greenville, began to crumble. A small trickle of water pushed through the saturated earth. Workers rushed to fill the gap with sandbags, but the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a torrent. Within minutes, that trickle became a roar. The levee did not simply break, it exploded. A wall of water 100 feet wide and 20 feet deep burst through the gap, carrying with it trees, houses, livestock, and human beings. The force of the breach was equivalent to the flow of Niagara Falls doubled. It was a cataract unleashed upon the flat delta landscape, with nothing to slow its advance. The sound was unlike anything the survivors would ever forget. Some described it as a freight train. Others said it sounded like thunder that never stopped. The water moved at 15 miles per hour, faster than a man could run, faster than a horse could gallop. It swept across the flat delta landscape with nothing to slow its advance. It carried everything before it. Barns and fences and wagons and the accumulated possessions of generations were lifted and tumbled and smashed into unrecognizable debris. The darkness made everything worse. People could hear the water coming before they could see it. They had seconds to react, seconds to climb, seconds to choose. In Greenville, people woke to chaos. The streets that had been dry at midnight were underwater by dawn. The Mississippi had not merely flooded, it had relocated. The river was no longer a defined channel between levees. It was everywhere, an inland sea stretching 30 miles wide and 100 miles long, covering an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The water was brown and cold and filled with debris. It tasted of mud and sewage and something else, something ancient, as if the river had brought up secrets from its deepest channels. William Percy rushed to organize the response. As the de facto leader of Greenville society, he took command of rescue operations, directing boats to the most endangered neighborhoods, establishing relief stations in the highest buildings. But the task was impossible. There were not enough boats, there were not enough rescuers, and the water kept rising. Every hour brought new reports of trapped families, collapsed buildings, missing persons. The telephone lines failed, the telegraph lines failed. Greenville was cut off from the outside world, an island in an ocean that had not existed 24 hours before. Mary Louise Hamilton gathered her students and led them to the roof of the schoolhouse. 12 children, ages 6 to 14, clung to her as the floodwaters swirled below. She counted heads repeatedly, making sure no one had been lost. She told them stories to keep them calm, stories of Moses and the Red Sea, of Noah and the Ark. She did not tell them that she could not swim. She did not tell them that she was terrified. She simply held them and prayed, and waited for rescue that might never come. Throughout the Delta, scenes of desperation unfolded. Farmers climbed into trees with their families, watching their life's work disappear beneath the brown tide. Sharecroppers who had nothing to begin with now had less than nothing. The mules drowned first, then the chickens, then the dogs. Some people drowned trying to save their animals. Others drowned trying to save each other. The water did not discriminate. It took the wealthy and the poor, the young and the old, the prepared and the unprepared. It took them with the same indifferent force, the same relentless momentum. The flood of 1927 would eventually cover 27,000 square miles across 7 states. It would displace nearly 1 million people, making it the largest migration in American history until that time. It would kill between 250 and 500 people, though the true number would never be known because many of the victims were poor, and poor people were not always counted. Their names were not recorded. Their bodies were not always recovered. They simply vanished into the brown water and were forgotten by everyone except those who loved them. But on that first morning, no one understood the scale of what was happening. They only knew that the water was rising, that the levees had failed, and that the world they had known was ending. They clung to rooftops and trees and anything that floated. They called out for help into the darkness. They listened for the sound of boats that might mean salvation. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you have ever felt that history speaks to us, that the stories of the past carry lessons we cannot afford to forget, then you belong here. Subscribe now because what comes next will change the way you see America forever. Chapter 2. The water did not stop. It had no intention of stopping. It was gravity made visible, the accumulated rainfall of half a continent seeking the lowest ground, and the lowest ground was the Mississippi Delta. The physics were simple and implacable. Water flows downhill. When there is enough water and enough hill, nothing built by human hands can stand against it. By noon on April 21st, Greenville was an island. The business district, built on slightly higher ground, remained above water, but just barely. Main Street had become a canal. Merchants waded through waist-deep currents to rescue inventory from their shops. The The telegraph office worked frantically to send messages to the outside world, but the lines kept failing as poles toppled into the flood. The railroad tracks were underwater. The roads were impassable. The bridges had been swept away or rendered useless by the torrent flowing beneath them. The response from Washington was slow. President Calvin Coolidge, a man famous for his reluctance to act, initially declined to visit the disaster zone. He believed that flood relief was a local matter, not a federal responsibility. The Constitution, in his view, did not authorize the federal government to rescue citizens from natural disasters. The states and localities should handle such matters. Private charity should supplement their efforts. The federal government should remain small and limited, and focused on its enumerated powers. This philosophy would prove inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe. The states affected by the flood were overwhelmed. Their treasuries were empty. Their administrative capacities were exhausted. Private charity, however generous, could not possibly meet the needs of 1 million displaced persons. Something more was required, something unprecedented. Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce, took charge of the relief effort. He was a man of considerable organizational skill, a mining engineer who had coordinated food aid to Europe during the Great War. Hoover understood logistics. He understood supply chains. He understood how to move resources from where they were abundant to where they were needed. What he did not understand, at least not fully, was the human dimension of the catastrophe. He saw the flood as a problem to be solved, not as a tragedy to be mourned. Hoover established a network of refugee camps along the levees and on patches of high ground throughout the Delta. He coordinated the delivery of food, clothing, medicine, and building materials. He mobilized the Red Cross, the National Guard, the Army, and countless volunteer organizations. He held press conferences and gave radio addresses, keeping the nation informed about the progress of relief efforts. He was everywhere at once, or seemed to be, a tireless administrator who never appeared to rest. In the refugee camps that sprouted along the levees and on the patches of high ground, conditions were desperate. Families huddled under tents made from bed sheets and tarpaulins. Clean water was scarce. Food was scarcer. Disease began to spread through the overcrowded camps. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, influenza. The children suffered most. Their immune systems were weakened by malnutrition and exposure. Their small bodies could not withstand the infections that swept through the camps like wildfire. The racial dynamics of the Delta shaped every aspect of the disaster response. White refugees were generally allowed to leave the camps and seek shelter with relatives or in nearby towns. They could board trains and travel to cities where they had connections. They could access bank accounts and insurance policies and the other financial resources that cushioned disaster. Black refugees were not granted these freedoms. They were held in the camps, often at gunpoint, forced to work on levee repair crews without pay. The planters who controlled the Delta economy feared that if their labor force escaped, it would never return. They needed those workers for the cotton harvest. They needed them to rebuild the farms and restore the economy. They were not willing to let them go. William Percy found himself caught between his humanitarian instincts and the social order he had inherited. He distributed food and supplies without regard to race, but he also enforced the labor requirements that kept black workers trapped in the camps. He believed he was acting in everyone's best interest. He believed that the Delta needed its workforce to recover, and that the workers themselves would benefit from remaining rather than fleeing to uncertain futures in northern cities. Years later, he would write about the flood in his memoir, describing it as a crucible that tested the character of the Delta. He did not acknowledge the ways in which that test revealed the moral failures of his own class. Mary Louise Hamilton and her students were rescued on the second day. A boat, piloted by 2 young men from the colored community, navigated through the flooded streets and brought them to a camp on the Greenville levee. The conditions were terrible. Thousands of people crowded onto a strip of muddy ground, barely wide enough to hold them. There was no shelter from the sun or the rain. There was no sanitation beyond a few hastily dug trenches. There was only the endless brown water stretching in every direction, a reminder of what had been lost and what might never be recovered. Mary Louise organized the children into groups. She led prayers in the morning and lessons in the afternoon. She wrote letters for illiterate parents trying to contact relatives in the north. She became a bridge between the desperate and the powerful, advocating for better conditions, more food, medical attention for the sick. She argued with camp administrators. She pleaded with doctors. She did everything in her power to protect the children who had been entrusted to her care. The sick were everywhere. The floodwaters were contaminated with sewage, animal carcasses, and chemicals from flooded warehouses. Anyone who swallowed even a mouthful risked infection. The camp doctors worked around the clock, but they were overwhelmed. They had to make impossible choices about who would receive treatment and who would be left to fate. They prioritized children and pregnant women when they could. They watched patients die, who might have been saved with adequate resources. One of the children Mary Louise had saved, a boy named Thomas Jefferson Williams, developed a fever on the third day. He was 10 years old, the eldest son of a sharecropper named Henry Williams. Thomas had always been a bright child, quick with numbers, curious about the world. His father had dreamed of sending him to school in Memphis, of giving him opportunities that the Delta could never provide. Now Thomas lay on a blanket in the mud, shivering despite the heat, his eyes glassy with fever. Mary Louise sat with Thomas through the night, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, whispering prayers into the darkness. She sang hymns softly, the same hymns they had sung at Mount Zion before the flood. She told him stories about heroes who had overcome impossible odds, about ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She simply stayed with him, willing him to survive. By morning his fever had broken. He would survive, but many others would not. The camp cemetery grew larger each day, a collection of wooden crosses marking the graves of those who had escaped the water, only to succumb to its aftermath. The flood reached its peak in early May. The Mississippi had spread across the Delta like a biblical judgment, erasing the boundaries between land and water, between the possible and the unimaginable. Aerial photographs showed nothing but brown expanse where there had once been fields and forests. The few trees that remained above water were crowded with people and animals, refugees clinging to the last remnants of solid ground. And still the water kept coming, fed by rains that would not stop, by tributaries that would not recede. Chapter 3. To understand why the Mississippi became an ocean in 1927, one must first understand what the Mississippi had always been. It was not simply a river, it was a force of nature that Americans had spent a century trying to control, and that century of effort had created the conditions for catastrophe. The Mississippi drains 40% of the continental United States. Rain that falls in Montana and Pennsylvania, in Minnesota and New Mexico, eventually finds its way to this single channel flowing south to the Gulf of Mexico. The watershed covers 1.25 million square miles. It includes all or part of 31 states. It is the third largest watershed in the world, exceeded only by the Amazon and the Congo. In the spring of 1927, that vast watershed received extraordinary rainfall. The winter had been wet across the entire region. Snow accumulated in the northern plains. Storms battered the Ohio Valley. By March, every tributary of the Mississippi was running high, and all of that water was converging on the Delta. The levee system that was supposed to protect the Delta was the product of a fundamental misunderstanding. Engineers in the 19th century believed that if they contained the river between high walls, the increased flow would scour the channel deeper, providing more capacity for floodwaters. They called this the levees-only policy. It was elegant in theory and catastrophic in practice. The theory suggested that a constrained river would become a self-cleaning river, that the velocity of the water would carry sediment downstream and maintain a deep channel capable of handling floods. The theory was wrong. What actually happened was the opposite. The levees prevented the river from spreading during normal floods, which meant that sediment accumulated in the channel instead of spreading across the floodplain. The riverbed rose higher year after year, inch by inch, foot by foot. The levees had to be raised to compensate. A cycle of escalation developed, each generation building the walls higher, each generation confident that they had finally tamed the beast. But the beast was not tamed, it was merely contained, merely temporarily, by walls that grew ever more fragile as the river grew ever more powerful. By 1927, the Mississippi flowed above the level of the surrounding land in many places. The levees were holding back not just a river, but an elevated lake, miles long and dozens of feet deep. The water behind those levees exerted enormous pressure on the earthen walls. Seepage was constant. Sand boils appeared wherever the pressure found weakness. Engineers patrolled the levees constantly, watching for signs of failure, filling holes and reinforcing weak points. It was a continuous battle, and the river was winning. The Army Corps of Engineers had known for years that the system was vulnerable. Internal reports warned of the danger. Engineers had written memos describing the limitations of the levees-only policy. They had proposed alternatives, including spillways, that would allow the river to spread during major floods, relieving the pressure on the levees. But the Corps was a political institution as much as a technical one. The planters and merchants of the Delta had enormous influence in Congress. They wanted levees and only levees because levees protected their land. The alternative, allowing the river to spread during floods through designated spillways and floodways, would have required sacrificing some land to save the rest. The powerful were not willing to sacrifice their own land, even to protect everyone else. And so the levees kept rising, and the river kept rising with them, until April 1927, when the entire system collapsed. The failure was not a surprise to those who had been paying attention. It was the inevitable consequence of a policy that had prioritized short-term protection over long-term sustainability, that had refused to acknowledge the limits of human engineering, that had believed progress could overcome nature. The human cost of this failure fell disproportionately on those who had no voice in the decisions. The sharecroppers who worked the Delta's cotton fields had never been consulted about flood policy. The black communities that lined the river had never been represented in the engineering debates. They simply endured the consequences of choices made by others. They had built their lives on land that powerful men had decided to protect with levees, and when those levees failed, they paid the price. If this story is moving something in your heart, if you feel the weight of what these people endured, leave a comment right now saying, "We must never forget 1927. Let the memory of their struggle become part of this community. Your words matter. Your presence here matters. Together we keep these stories alive." The response to the 1927 flood would eventually transform American government. It was the first natural disaster that demonstrated the federal government's capacity for large-scale relief operations. Herbert Hoover's management of the crisis would propel him to the presidency. The flood would lead directly to the Flood Control Act of 1928, which finally abandoned the levees-only policy and created the modern system of spillways and reservoirs that protects the Delta today. But these changes came too late for the people trapped in the camps in May 1927. They did not know that their suffering would reshape federal policy. They only knew that they were hungry, sick, and far from home. The Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, had been underway since the First World War. Economic opportunities in northern factories, combined with the violence and oppression of the Jim Crow South, had already drawn hundreds of thousands of black Southerners to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York. But the flood of 1927 accelerated this movement dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of black Southerners, displaced from their homes and disillusioned with the treatment they received in the refugee camps, decided never to return to the Delta. They had seen how the planters valued their labor more than their lives. They had experienced the coercion and the contempt. They were done. They boarded trains for Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York. They carried with them the music and culture of the Delta, the blues that would become the foundation of American popular music. They carried memories of the flood and stories of survival. They carried determination to build better lives in places where their children might have opportunities. The flood did not create the Great Migration, but it transformed it from a significant movement into a mass exodus. The Mississippi that had carried cotton to market would now carry the stories of displacement and determination to every corner of the nation. Chapter 4. In the camps along the levees, a quiet resistance was forming. It was not organized in any formal sense. It had no leaders, no manifestos, no explicit agenda. But it was real, and it was growing. The work crews that the planters had forced into service began to slow their efforts. Men who had been told to fill sandbags found reasons to rest. They complained of illness. They moved slowly. They took long breaks. Others simply walked away, disappearing into the chaos of the refugee masses. The guards could not shoot everyone. The work could not be completed without cooperation, and cooperation was evaporating. Mary Louise Hamilton became a witness to this transformation. She saw men who had spent their entire lives deferring to white authority begin to question, quietly but unmistakably, why they should continue. She heard conversations at night, whispered discussions about leaving the Delta entirely, about starting over in cities where a man might be paid for his labor and treated as a citizen. She heard women talking about relatives in Chicago who had written letters describing jobs and apartments and schools where black children could learn alongside white children. She heard young people dreaming of futures that the Delta could never offer. Henry Williams, the father of young Thomas, was among those planning to leave. He had worked the same plot of land for 15 years, owing more to the landlord at the end of each season than he had at the beginning. The system was designed to keep him in debt. The prices he received for his cotton were set by the landlord. The prices he paid for supplies were set by the landlord. The books were kept by the landlord. There was no way to get ahead, no way to accumulate savings, no way to escape. The flood had destroyed his cabin, his tools, his mule. It had destroyed everything he had worked to build, but it had also destroyed his patience. It had destroyed his willingness to accept a system that treated him as something less than human. In late May, when the waters began to recede and the planters started talking about the next cotton crop, Henry Williams gathered his family and walked to the train station. He had saved nothing. He had almost nothing to carry, but he had made a decision that no floodwater could undo. He was going north. He was going to Chicago, where his wife's cousin had found work in a meat-packing plant. He was going to start over, at the age of 43, with nothing but his hands and his determination. Thousands made the same choice. They left the Delta in waves, crowding onto trains, riding in cattle cars, walking when they had to. The planters tried to stop them. They posted guards at train stations. They confiscated luggage. They threatened consequences. They spread rumors that the North was hostile, that jobs did not exist, that black families would freeze in the Chicago winters. Some of these warnings were even true. The North was not a promised land. It had its own forms of discrimination and hardship. The jobs were dangerous. The housing was segregated. The winters were brutal. But it was not the Delta, and after what had happened in 1927, that was enough. The relief effort continued through the summer. The Red Cross distributed food, clothing and building materials. Work crews repaired the levees, raising them higher than before, reinforcing them with concrete and steel. Farmers replanted their fields, hoping to salvage something from the growing season. By fall, something resembling normalcy had returned to parts of the Delta. The water had receded. The crops were growing. The merchants had reopened their shops. But normalcy was an illusion. The social order that had seemed so permanent before the flood would never be fully restored. William Percy spent the rest of his life defending the world of his fathers. He wrote poetry and essays celebrating the gentility of the Old South. He insisted that the plantation system had been benevolent, that the sharecroppers had been content, that the Delta had been a harmonious community before outside agitators disrupted it. His memoir, Lanterns on the Levee, published in 1941, would become a classic of Southern literature. Praised for its elegance and criticized for its blindness, he could not see, or would not see, the ways in which the system he celebrated had failed the people who depended on it. Mary Louise Hamilton stayed in Greenville. She rebuilt her school. She continued teaching children whose parents could not read, whose grandparents had been enslaved, whose futures had never been bright but were dimmer now than ever. She did not write memoirs or give speeches. She simply did the work, year after year, until she retired in 1952. She died in 1967, at the age of 72, largely forgotten by the town she had served. Thomas Jefferson Williams grew up in Chicago. He finished high school, the first member of his family to do so. He found work in a steel mill, then in an automobile factory. He married a woman from Mississippi, another flood refugee, and they raised children who went to college and became professionals. When Thomas was an old man, he would sometimes tell stories about the flood, about the schoolteacher who had saved his life, about the train ride north that had changed everything. His grandchildren listened with the distant interest of people who have never known real hardship. They could not imagine the Delta of 1927. They could not imagine the water rising in the darkness. They could only imagine their grandfather as he was, an old man in a warm house in a city that had given him everything the Delta had denied. These were the threads that the flood had woven into the fabric of American history. Each refugee who left the Delta carried a story. Each story became part of a larger narrative of movement and transformation. The Mississippi had not simply flooded. It had pushed millions of people into new lives, new cities, new possibilities. Chapter 5. The political aftermath of the 1927 flood would reshape American government in ways that still resonate today. It established precedents and created expectations that continue to influence how the nation responds to disasters. Herbert Hoover emerged from the disaster as a national hero. His organizational skills, his tireless work ethic, his ability to coordinate relief efforts across state lines and bureaucratic boundaries made him the most visible figure of the crisis. He had fed hungry people. He had sheltered the homeless. He had demonstrated that large-scale problems required large-scale solutions. The newspapers celebrated him as a master administrator, a man who could solve any problem through careful planning and efficient execution. When Hoover ran for president in 1928, his management of the flood relief was central to his campaign. He promised to bring the same efficiency and competence to the federal government that he had brought to the relief effort. He won in a landslide, carrying even states that had been Democratic strongholds for generations. The man who had fed Europe during the Great War and saved the Delta from the Great Flood seemed destined for greatness. But the Great Depression would destroy Hoover's reputation. The same qualities that had made him effective in 1927, his belief in volunteerism, his reluctance to use direct government intervention, his faith in private charity and local initiative, proved catastrophic when the economy collapsed in 1929. The man who had organized private relief efforts could not organize a national recovery. He believed that the Depression would end naturally if the government simply allowed market forces to work. He was wrong. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. They looked to the federal government for help, and the federal government, under Hoover's leadership, refused to provide it. Hoover was swept from office in 1932, replaced by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. The irony was bitter. Hoover had demonstrated in 1927 that the federal government could respond to disasters on a national scale. He had shown that coordination and planning could save lives and rebuild communities. But he had refused to apply those lessons to economic disaster. He had shown what was possible and then failed to achieve it when it mattered most. Roosevelt, by contrast, embraced the expanded role of government that the 1927 flood had prefigured. The New Deal agencies that put Americans back to work, the social security system that protected the elderly, the rural electrification that brought power to the countryside, the banking regulations that stabilized the financial system, all of these grew from the recognition that individual effort was not enough, that collective action through government was sometimes necessary. The flood of 1927 had been a rehearsal for the New Deal, a demonstration that the federal government could manage large-scale crises. Roosevelt took that lesson and applied it to the largest crisis the nation had ever faced. The Flood Control Act of 1928 represented a fundamental shift in how America approached the Mississippi. The levees-only policy was finally abandoned. A new system of floodways and spillways was designed to give the river room to spread during major floods, protecting the most vulnerable areas by sacrificing less populated ones. The Bonnet Carré Spillway, completed in 1931, allowed excess water to flow into Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf of Mexico. The Morganza Floodway, completed in 1954, provided additional capacity. The Birds Point New Madrid Floodway gave the river an escape valve in Missouri. These engineering changes were enormously expensive. They required the federal government to take responsibility for flood control in ways it never had before. They established precedents for federal involvement in infrastructure that would extend to highways, airports, communications networks, and countless other projects in the decades to come. The flood of 1927 did not create the modern federal government, but it demonstrated what that government could do and created expectations that it would do more. The cultural impact of the flood was equally profound. The blues, born in the Delta and carried north by the Great Migration, became the foundation of American popular music. Bessie Smith, the empress of the blues, recorded a song called Backwater Blues about the flood that became a sensation. The song captured the terror and the loss, the helplessness of people watching everything they owned disappear beneath the water. Charlie Patton, Son House, Robert Johnson, and other Delta musicians sang about the disaster in ways that captured both its horror and its strange beauty. They sang about the water rising, about the refugees fleeing, about the world transformed. These songs were more than entertainment. They were a form of historical memory, a way of preserving the experience of the flood for generations who would never see the waters rise. They carried the voices of the sharecroppers and the refugees into concert halls and recording studios, into jukeboxes and radios, into the collective consciousness of a nation that was still learning how to listen. The blues would influence jazz and rock and roll and hip-hop. It would shape the sound of American music for a century, and at its heart was the memory of the flood, the experience of loss and survival that had defined a generation. The flood also changed the political landscape of the South. The black voters who left the Delta and settled in northern cities became a significant electoral force. They voted Democratic, abandoning the party of Lincoln for the party that seemed more willing to address their concerns. This realignment would accelerate during the New Deal and reach its culmination during the Civil Rights Movement. The Great Migration transformed the demographics of American cities and the dynamics of American politics. The flood of 1927 was not the only cause of these changes, but it was a catalyst, an accelerant that sped the transformation along. In this sense, the flood of 1927 was not just a natural disaster. It was a catalyst for political and cultural transformations that would reshape the 20th century. It revealed the limitations of existing institutions and created the conditions for new ones. It displaced millions of people and scattered them across the nation, creating new communities and new possibilities. It demonstrated what government could do and raised expectations about what it should do. The river that had seemed so stable and controllable had proven to be wild and dangerous, and in doing so, it had changed everything. Chapter 6. 97 years have passed since the Mississippi became an ocean. The levees have been rebuilt, stronger and more sophisticated than before. The spillways and floodways have been tested and proven effective. The river still rises every spring, but the catastrophic floods of 1927 have not been repeated. And yet the lessons of 1927 are not lessons that stay learned. Each generation must learn them anew, and each generation finds new ways to forget. The confidence that led engineers to believe they could control the river has not disappeared. It has simply taken new forms. We build higher levees and stronger spillways. We develop more sophisticated computer models and more accurate weather forecasts. We believe that technology can protect us from the forces of nature, and perhaps it can. Perhaps the investments made since 1927 have truly tamed the Mississippi, but climate change is making extreme weather events more frequent and more intense. The rainfall patterns that caused the 1927 flood are becoming more common, not less. Hurricanes are growing stronger. Sea levels are rising. The infrastructure built to protect the delta is aging. The next great flood may not be a matter of if, but when. The social structures that determined who suffered most in 1927 have also proven resistant to change. The Delta remains one of the poorest regions in America. The descendants of the sharecroppers who rebuilt after the flood still struggle with inadequate infrastructure, limited opportunities, and the legacy of generations of exploitation. The Great Migration dispersed the Delta's population, but it did not solve the Delta's problems. It simply relocated them, spreading the consequences of historical injustice across the entire nation. In Greenville, the old levee where thousands of refugees once huddled is now a park. Children play on grass that covers the mud where their great-great-grandparents waited for rescue. The river flows quietly past, contained for now behind walls of concrete and steel. The steamboats are gone, replaced by barges carrying grain and petroleum. The cotton fields have shrunk, replaced by soybeans and catfish farms. The town is smaller than it was in 1927, its population diminished by decades of economic decline and outmigration. The schoolhouse where Mary Louise Hamilton sheltered her students has been replaced by a modern building with air conditioning and computers and standardized test scores. Her name is not remembered by most of the people who pass through its halls. There is no plaque commemorating her service. There is no statue honoring her courage. She has been forgotten, as most people who do good work in difficult circumstances are eventually forgotten. But her work continues in the teachers who inherited her mission, who still believe that education can transform lives even in the poorest communities, who still stay with children through the floods that come in every generation, literal and metaphorical. Thomas Jefferson Williams passed away in 1998 at the age of 81. He was buried in Chicago, far from the Delta where he was born. His children scattered his ashes in Lake Michigan, letting the water that had threatened his life as a boy receive him at the end as a man. It seemed fitting. Water had defined his life, had driven him from his home, had carried him to a new beginning. Water would carry him into whatever came next. His grandchildren still live in Chicago. They are lawyers and teachers and business people. They vote in elections and pay taxes and raise their own children. They are fully American in a way that Thomas could never quite be, having been born into a system that denied his humanity. They know the story of the flood, the basic facts at least. They know that their grandfather came from Mississippi, that there was a disaster, that the family moved north, but they do not feel it the way Thomas felt it. They cannot feel the water rising around them in the darkness. They cannot feel the terror and the determination. They can only know it as history, as something that happened to someone else. The Mississippi remembers nothing. Rivers do not have memory. They have only momentum, the ceaseless movement of water toward the sea. But we remember. We carry the stories of the flood in our music and our history, in the cities that grew from the migration, in the policies that emerged from the disaster. We carry them imperfectly, incompletely, losing details with each generation, but we carry them. We remember the morning when the levees broke and the world went brown. We remember the families who lost everything, and the families who started over. We remember the failures and the heroism, the cruelty and the kindness, the choices that shaped a century. We remember because remembering is what makes us human, what connects us to those who came before and those who will come after. The 1927 flood did not simply happen to America. It made America. It revealed what the nation was and pointed toward what it might become. It showed that nature could not be controlled, only negotiated with. It demonstrated that human systems, however elaborate, would eventually be tested beyond their limits. And it proved that catastrophe, for all its horror, could also be a beginning. New communities formed in the cities of the North. New music emerged from the experience of loss. New policies recognized the responsibility of government to protect its citizens. New possibilities opened for people who had been trapped in systems designed to exploit them. The day the Mississippi became an ocean was the day America learned that it was not exempt from the forces that shape all human societies. Flood and drought, abundance and scarcity, the slow accumulation of consequences from decisions made by the powerful, all of these would continue to shape the nation long after the waters receded. The river taught a lesson that America is still learning, still forgetting, still learning again. Today, as storms intensify and sea levels rise, as infrastructure ages and budgets shrink, the lessons of 1927 are more relevant than ever. The river is still there, flowing past Greenville and Memphis and New Orleans, carrying the water of 31 states toward the Gulf. The levees are still there, higher and stronger than before, but not invincible. The people who live in the shadow of both are still there, hoping that the promises made after the last disaster will be kept, hoping that the investments made in their protection will prove sufficient. Perhaps they will. Perhaps the engineers and politicians have learned enough to prevent the next catastrophe. Perhaps the spillways and floodways will do their job. Perhaps the computer models will predict the floods in time. Perhaps the evacuation plans will work. Or perhaps the Mississippi will surprise us again, as it surprised the confident engineers of 1927. Perhaps the levees that seem so strong will prove no stronger than the levees that failed nearly a century ago. Perhaps the cycle will repeat, and a new generation will learn the same hard lessons their ancestors learned in the brown waters of the Delta. This is the nature of rivers and the nature of history. They flow in one direction, but they carry the past with them. The water that passed through Greenville in April 1927 has long since reached the Gulf and evaporated into clouds. But the consequences of that water are still with us, still shaping the land and the people, still waiting to be understood. The Mississippi remembers nothing, but we must remember everything. We must remember the levees that failed and the people who suffered. We must remember the refugees who rebuilt their lives and the communities that welcomed them. We must remember the music that emerged from the tragedy and the policies that tried to prevent its recurrence. We must remember because memory is the only protection we have against repeating the mistakes of the past. The river flows on, the stories continue, and we, the living, carry the memory forward. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel." Your presence here means something. Every view, every comment, every moment you spend with these stories helps preserve the memories that deserve to be preserved. Please take a second to like this video if it moved you and share it with someone who loves history. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. These stories need witnesses. Be one of them. The river flows on, but the stories remain. Thank you for being here. Thank you for remembering.